try to mute some participants here. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. So we are quite honored to have Prof. Elaine, who is going to be presenting on a very interesting talk today. So let me quickly introduce our speaker today, Professor Elaine Hui, who is an associate professor of labor and employment relations and Asian studies at Penn State University. Her research investigates the role of the state and laws in shaping labor relations, work collective actions, in their and as well as their impacts on institutional arrangements, labor-related civil society actors, as well as the social welfare system within, of course, with primary focus on China. And more recently, she has begun to examine labor relations in Chinese multinational corporations that are operating in the United States of America. And her work has appeared in a number of journals, such as Theory and Society, Human Relations, British Journal of Industrial Relations, as well as Chinese Quarterly. And she's also an author of Hegemonic Transformation, the State, Laws, and Labor Relations in Post-Socialist China, that was published by Palgrave Macmillan. So we're really excited for this talk, and we really appreciate you agreeing to share your work with us today. So without further ado, let me hand over to Prof. Elaine to get us started.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simber. Thank you for having us today. It's my honor to be able to have a conversation with you all here today about China, Chinese labor relations, and Chinese multinational corporations in overseas. And I'm not sure like how I don't know a lot of the background of the participants, so my presentations might not be able to address some questions you already have, but I think maybe let me present what I prepared, and then if you have questions, then I can answer at the end of the section. Let me share my PowerPoint first. I'm not super familiar with Teams, so
With Teams.
yeah, so then I might take some time.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I think there's a, if you check between on your, it should be your top right corner, where there's the mic, then there's a share button, then that should allow you to share.
Yes, and then I have to pick my, oh, this one. I thought it's loading my
Yes,
presentation.
yes.
Can you
Something
yes?
is coming up. Yes, something is coming up now. Yes.
Does it come up right, the PowerPoint?
Yes. Yes, it's actually on slideshow. It's coming up well.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, this is great. So my presentation will focus on two parts. One is about labor relations in China, and because I think for a lot of overseas students or scholars, if they have to understand Chinese MNCs, they also have to understand what's happening in China in terms of labor relations. So then my presentations will be divided into two parts. One is about labor relations in China, and then the second part is about Chinese MNCs abroad. Oh, I have, wait, I think the effects doesn't show. Wait. Check. I think the slides doesn't show all my points.
Yeah, on I think it's showing this side. It's actually showing. It's on the first. Now it's the third slide.
Okay. Some of the points are missing from here, and also I have some animation. But anyway, so
Okay.
Sorry, sorry for the technology issues. So, for Chinese state, increasingly, I teach about China in my undergraduate courses and postgraduate courses, and increasingly, I feel like China as a political regime has become more like a mystery to people. For a while, I think a lot of students they immediately know that like in China they don't have democracy, they have an authoritarian regime. But then in the last few years, starting increasingly more students they're unsure. They thought, oh, China has democracy there. I don't know what's exactly the reason there, but just in case everybody's may not be on the same page, China has an authoritarian regime. There's no democracy. People don't have the right to vote in any elections. And the state is also very not monolithic. There's scholars emphasizing on the authoritarian aspect of the state, and which doesn't show up on my slide is also Chinese state is a developmental state, which because it play a strong interventionist role in organizing the economy and facilitating the economic growth. So China is also as a developmental state, and also it is a cooperative state. Also, it doesn't show up on this slide. I don't know why my slides got distorted in Tim. So China is also being seen as a cooperative state because it kind of control a lot of social organizations, unions, employer associations, professional associations, and etc. So no organizations are allowed to be set up or established outside the control of the Communist Party. So all the organizations that are incorporated into the state structures, so then it's also a corporate state. So it's both authoritarian states, developmental states, corporate state. And also oftentimes for people who are not familiar with China, they feel like, oh, the Chinese state is very powerful. And they see China or Chinese state as monolithic, as just controlled by Xi Jinping, our president. But actually, there's a lot of studies saying that the Chinese government, Chinese states, they are very diversified with a lot, very fragmented. The central government, with the central government led by Xi Jinping, and also we have local governments in different provinces, or what the US here people call different states. I don't know in South Africa do you call it province or call it state. So in each province in China, they have their own government. So the central government, they generally they're responsible for maintaining political legitimacy and social stability. Therefore, you will see a lot of like government top officials like Xi Jinping or other like prominent politicians. They have a strong rhetoric about labor politics, about protecting the working class, working people. So because their major responsibilities or major division of labor in terms of politics is to maintain political legitimacy. So, but then a lot of local governments, different state governments, they are being tasked with the mission of promote economic growth. So a lot of dirty work is being done at the local government level. So like how they try to attract foreign investment by suppressing labor rights, all those are happening at the local government level. And then, so I have to also at the same time turn to my real slides. So that takes me sometimes. Oh, okay. So this shows a 3/8. Oh, I think this actually, wait, I might not actually be showing the right slides. Sorry, that's maybe the problem. Thank you for your patience. Here, sorry for the confusion. Blame this. Oh, stop sharing. Can you guys see the slides now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you can see it. Okay, good. So now it's the first page, right? There, what you see is my first page of the slides. Is it moving?
Yeah, it's moving.
Okay, great, thank you. So then, my own research. Oh, one questions I always being asked is China a socialist country? So before 1978, it's a state socialist country in the sense that it is trying to practice socialism, but it's also not having democracy there. It's controlled by the state. So before 1978, definitely China is a state socialist country. But right now, my own opinion is that China is actually not a socialist country. It's practicing capitalism, but in a way that is different than capitalism being practiced in US, Europe, or Africa. And so I described this process of China. King started this economic reform in 1978 as passive revolutions, which means the Chinese government was trying to introduce capitalism with top-down effort. So it tried to implement, or it implemented a lot of economic policies, social policies, and legal policies to facilitate capital accumulations with the economic reform. And even for up to this period, this is true too. So what did the Chinese government do or has been doing is before the economic reform, before the introduction of the capitalist system in China, there's basically no market economy in China. So there's only planned economy. But then after the economic reform, the Chinese state, they have implemented various social, economic, legal policies to create a market economy and to create a capitalist class. The capitalist class, including their foreign investors, including private domestic capitalists, including the state-owned enterprises. And then other things that the Chinese state has been doing is to create a labor market. Again, before the economic reform, there was no labor market. Everybody, they got a job. The government, they're responsible for allocating jobs. The government responsible for scheduling people to work. But then with the economic reform, the government introduced a labor market that workers sells the labor power. So before the economic reform, the labor power, they were not commodified. But then with the formation of the labor market, labor power has been starting to be commodified as a product to be sold. And therefore, the Chinese government also created the exploited class. And other type of policies being created is to create this capitalist wage setting. Before the economic reform, basically wage was determined by the government alone, depending on factors of the seniority of the workers, the needs of the workers, and etc. But with the economic reform, now capitalism is involved, is being introduced. The government set up a capitalist wage setting mechanisms, which means like the demand and supply rules dominate and wage setting. And the fourth element is that through various policies, the Chinese government has been also trying to control the class organizations. They know very well that if the workers are organized collectively and independently from the government, they would pose serious danger to the legitimacy of the government, to the power of the Communist Party, and to the social stability. So this is my viewpoint on whether China is a socialist country or not. I think it is not a socialist country, but it is not exactly a capitalist country like a majority of the countries in this globe. And about labor relations in China, about the trade unions. And again, like this, a lot of students of mine in the past years, they didn't know that trade unions in China were controlled by the Communist Party and by the state. So in China, there is no independent unions, which means if you try to set up a union that is independent from the Communist Party or from the state, you will be put to jail. In China, they adopted the state corporatism. Again, it means like the unions, the professional associations, employer associations, they are all part of the state structures. And the union leaders, employer association leaders, professional association leaders, they are all picked by the government or the states, not elected by their constituents. For the trade union during the Maoist period before the economic reform, the employment relations, labor relations were seen as taboo. Oh, is it okay?
Hello?
Yeah,
Hello?
okay. You guys can still hear me, right?
So, sorry, Elaine. Let me
Yeah.
check who it is and mute. Sorry about that,
No
Elaine.
problem. I just want to make sure you guys can still hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So during the Maoist period before the economic reform, labor relations were deemed as harmonious because there was actually the employers were actually the Communist Party, the state. So then they think labor relations were harmonious. There shouldn't be any conflicts if the state was their employer. And back then, the unions, they did not represent the workers versus the management. So what they did, they acted as transmission belts between the party state and the workers. They try to mobilize the workers to increase productions, to follow the party state's agenda, and occasionally they reflect what the workers think up to the party state. So, but then with the economic reform that starting in 1978, there's a lot more employment issues. And employers are no longer just the states. There's a lot of foreign investors, private domestic investors, and there's a lot more workers. They're being subjected to exploitation, and the unions they started to try to represent the workers, and also they try to help the workers to a certain extent. I'm sorry, I didn't mention it here. Anyway, but even so, workers they still cannot organize their own independent unions, just like in the Maoist period. All the unions that is formed, they must be affiliated to the government and the state. So for the union itself, they are nothing like the unions in South Africa, or in other countries that the unions, they are meaningfully representing the workers, fighting for their rights and interests. So the trade unions in China, they are super service oriented, which means a lot of time if they are not dominant, if they're not legislating, then a lot of time what they're doing is just organizing recreational activities, like organizing workers to go hiking or barbecue, or just like during some big festivals like Chinese New Year or Mid-Autumn Festival, just give out gifts to workers. And to understand the unions in China, the lower level unions, the workplace unions, a lot of them are controlled by managers. And a lot of the workplace unions, their chairpersons, they are actually the HR managers. And at the lower level, at the workplace level, workers basically they don't have associational power. And the unions higher up, like the national unions, like the All China Federation of Trade Unions, ACFTU, they are more subjected to the control of the state and the manipulation of the state. So they do not have associational power either because they don't really actually organize the workers, but they have relatively strong administrative power because they're part of the state corporate structures. Oftentimes, some employers, if they don't know about the politics too well in China, when ACFTU, this All China Federation of Trade Unions, approach them to make some recourse, some employers will be quite responsive because they think ACFTU is part of the state structures, and then they're quite scared of Communist Party, and therefore they would also be quite concerned about ACFTU. The All China Federation of Trade Unions, they are not very active in really organizing workers. But they are active in labor policies and labor laws making to make sure that to a certain extent it's protecting workers, but to a certain extent it's not too progressive. So not all the higher level unions, they do organizing work, but if they do, or they do try to help the workers, they try to direct labor activism to a legal arena. They don't prefer collective actions of workers. They always try to talk workers out of collective actions, talk workers out of strikes. But if it's individual disputes, they would support the workers with individual disputes, and also they try to direct workers towards the legal arena, like having mediation, arbitration, and court, rather than having non-legal actions like going on strike or reaching out to employers as a collective to talk. That's not what they prefer. They prefer legal actions, and also they prefer non-contentious actions, which means don't cause troubles, like try to be reasonable, try to be harmonious with workplace. So this is like what the trade unions in China they are doing. Like they are not totally without actions to support workers, but if they do support the workers, it's mostly to support those who have individual grievance and to direct them to legal and non-contentious arenas. And also one thing to note about the trade unions in China is they have a double institutional identity, which means they have two roles to play. First of all, they act as a state instrument, state apparatus to serve the state agenda, promote a state agenda. And secondly, to a certain extent, they work as a labor organizations in the way that I described. They only focus on legal, individual, and non-contentious actions of workers. And most importantly, if these two institutional roles of workers, they conflict with each other, the role of being a state apparatus will always prevail over the role of the unions as a labor organizations. And then about labor regimes in China, like a lot of labor practices in China has been and is still very exploitating, and that's why a lot of scholars they characterize the labor regimes in China as despotic regime, coercive disciplinary regime. And one study or two studies try to capture that, oh, actually some employers, they started to build hegemonic regimes, but a lot more other studies, they emphasize on various dimensions of the despotic regime. Some said, oh, China had the localistic despotism, contested despotic labor regime. So I'm not going to all the details of all those definitions, but we can still, I would say like the labor regimes in China mostly is despotic, but occasionally there may be some hegemonic labor regimes existing in China. And for a long, long time, the workers that are active in promoting their rights and interests, they are from the manufacturing sectors because for a long time, China has been depending on manufacturing export industries. And a lot of those workers working in the manufacturing industries, they are internal migrants or rural migrants coming from rural areas to work in the cities. But over time, in starting from like the last 10 years, over time, there's also more workers that work in the service industry or white collar workers or those who work in the platform with economies. They also have staged a lot of different types of actions like strikes, protests, petitions, and etc. And about the trend of workers' resistance in China, despite the fact that the state is very controlling, authoritarian, and repressive, and also the employers, they are also very exploitating. The workers' resistance has been quite noticeable in China. The number of collective actions staged by the workers have increased over the years, and also the second generation of the migrant workers, they were being seen as very different from their parent generations who were usually very tolerant of bitterness, tolerance of exploitation, but then second generations of the migrant workers, they're being seen as like more vocal, more willing to fight for their right. And also the work actions of the workers were being seen as have been going through a process of radicalizations, being more radical over time. And there's a study saying that, oh, the new working class in China has been forming. And also the actions of the workers has been characterized from at first being defensive, which means they try to protect their legal rights, to now they are more offensive in the sense that they try to ask for more than the laws would give them. Like they want more, they want the rights beyond legal entitlement. And then my own research was suggesting that for the workers, some of them, they give active consent to the ruling bloc, which means the state and the capitalists agreeing to what they are doing. But quite a lot of them, they just give passive consent in the sense that they just feel like they cannot change. They just go along with the flow. And also some of them, they are very critical with the state, with the capitalist system, and they didn't give consent at all. So this is the part about the Chinese labor relations. Any questions so far? Is there any burning questions before I move on to talking about Chinese MNCs? Okay. So then I will talk about Chinese multinationals abroad. So I think for a lot of like labor activists, unions, or scholars outside of China, their concern is, oh, when the Chinese MNCs, they are investing over the world, are they bringing with them their exploitative labor practices they are having in China to the host countries? So I think this is like a starting point for a lot of people to get interested in this topic about Chinese MNCs abroad. We'll address these questions at the end. But let me show you some figures. Here is the Chinese FDI and US FDI to Africa in the last years. And we can see the trend that the US FDI has been decreasing, and then Chinese FDI flowing to Africa has been increasing. And at a certain point, I think it's outgrew the FDI from US. And if we just focus on Chinese FDI in Africa, also there's a growing trend in the last 15 years. And most of the Chinese FDI, they, according to my figures here, I haven't updated it. So it's till 2020. Most of them went to South Africa, and then Congo, Zambia, Ethiopia, and etc. And the Chinese FDI, they have a lot of them that went to the construction industry and the mining, manufacturing, and etc. So Chinese FDI or Chinese MNCs, they have been growing so much abroad because of some mechanisms that Chinese government have been promoting, including the Belt and Road initiatives. The Belt and Road initiative is actually the mechanisms that Chinese government try to export its infrastructural projects, and also help Chinese MNCs to gain business in more than 1/3 of the world. And so people may ask, oh, why all of a sudden there's an increasing Chinese FDI? So a lot of people think, oh, Chinese MNCs is growing because China is now a rising power and etc. But for scholars that study these issues, actually the rise of Chinese MNCs mirrors two weaknesses of the Chinese state and Chinese economy. So first of all, in China, they have been having the overproduction crisis. So there's a lot of investment. Chinese economy for a long time has been depending on manufacturing industries and also depending on their infrastructural projects in China. And I don't know whether you have heard of like ghost cities in China. Like there's like a lot of second tier, third tier cities. They have brand new buildings, apartment buildings, but nobody's living there. So those infrastructural projects, they fueled Chinese economy for a while, but then they could not really sustain its economy. For example, like all those buildings, they are being abandoned. Nobody lives there. And a lot of Chinese government's budget, the mass investors, they spend on their infrastructural projects. And therefore, like the productive capacity in China has been existing what the Chinese people can consume. So for a long, long time, for more than 20 decades or so, the Chinese government has been having a headache in turning the manufacturing-based economy into a consumption-based economy. So because of a lot of different issues. But anyway, in brief, the Chinese people, especially the workers, because of the low wages, because of the no benefit, and etc., they do not actually have a strong consumption power. And therefore, they create this problem that they invest too much on productions and there is not enough consumptions. So in China, they have been having production crises, and therefore they need a spatial fix. They need to direct those production capacity overseas. And that's contributing to their MNC, the rise of MNCs abroad. And other reason for Chinese government to promote Chinese MNCs to going out is to maintain political support because the Chinese government is an authoritarian regime. They could not gain political legitimacy through elections. So one way for the Chinese government to really maintain its political legitimacy is to rely on nationalisms. So in the past, it's always built on nationalist rhetoric to gather support from the public. And now that China's MNCs is able to go overseas to invest and etc., this also helps boost nationalism in China and thus help maintaining political support for their Communist Party and the Chinese state. So these are basically like two key reasons that contribute to the rise of Chinese MNCs and contribute to the government's strong promotions of MNCs to go abroad. So I know there's a lot of Chinese MNCs in South Africa and in other African countries. I think it will be interesting for the South African or African people to know about like there's different hierarchy for Chinese capital, Chinese MNCs. So they're not born equal. So the highest hierarchy is the central SOE stand for state-owned enterprises, state enterprises. So for company MNCs that is owned by the central government and the policy banks, they are of the most important strategic importance to China. They're most important to China. And then there's some other state-owned enterprises, they're owned by the provincial government. They are of the second importance. So, but they are not as important as the central state-owned enterprise. And then thirdly, there's some private enterprises. They are not as important as central or provincial state enterprises. And then lastly, there's some small-scale entrepreneur and family firms. They are below in the ranking. So they are not super important to the Chinese economy or super important to from the Chinese government's point of view. So I think if I don't know the labor movement in South Africa, if they really like or want to target Chinese MNCs, they need to do some company research. And then this is one thing to start with, whether the company is owned by central government, policy banks, like provincial government, or just any private enterprises. I think this will help you to determine your strategies and to determine how important this company is in China. And Li Qinghuan, she conducted a study about Zambia, Chinese corporations in Zambia. Her research was saying that the Chinese state capital in Zambia at least has two logics. So the first logic is state logics. So the state capital, they don't simply try to maximize the profits. What they are seeking to is also they seek to gain political influence in Zambia and to gain patronage and also to have access to resources in Zambia. So this is from the Chinese state point of view. They don't simply want money. They have money and they want to influence politics there and they want to have resources, natural resources there. And then the Chinese capital, like the Chinese central and provincial SOEs, the enterprises, they also have a second logic, which is capital logic, which is to gain capital, to have capital accumulations. And in Li Jingguan's proposed that like the Chinese states, Chinese capital in Zambia, they are pursuing encompassing accumulations, which means that they do not try to pursue profit maximization. Instead, they just try to pursue profit optimization, which means they don't need to earn as much as they can, but they want to maintain a certain level of profit. And at the same time, as I mentioned, driven by the state logic, they want to gain political influence, access to natural resources. And oftentimes people feel like, the Chinese MNC, they might be very powerful, or this process of Chinese multinational companies going to invest overseas, they are so well planned by the Chinese government. The Chinese government have a whole plan that they want to implement. So my observation and Li Jinghuan's observation is actually quite different from this common sense understanding of Chinese MNC and Chinese government's planning with MNCs. So it's true that the Chinese government has been trying to promote Chinese companies to go out. So this going out strategies is true that is promoted by the central government, and this is expressing part of the centralized control of the government. But oftentimes, like the implementation and the outcomes of the MNCs investing in a country, they are results of local improvisation, which means the Chinese government doesn't actually get a whole degree of control over the implementation of the outcomes. And the result and the outcomes of their MNC investment, they're shaped by Chinese firms overseas and the state agents overseas. The Chinese firms, I mean, like, of course, they broadly speaking, they have to follow the agenda of the state and the Communist Party, but sometimes they have disagreement. So then once they're out of China, they have their own capital logic of the Chinese firms. The Chinese firms, they might have different ideas from the Chinese central government. But once they're out of China, they feel like they have more freedom. So, and they would be just doing things sometimes maybe not exactly consistent with what the Chinese central government want them to do. But the Chinese governments on the ground, they are actually shaping the implementations and outcomes of the Chinese investments overseas. And also the Chinese state agents stationing in host countries, they oftentimes also might not be in total agreement with the central government's planning or central government's directives. So they have some agencies that they exercise to actually shape the outcomes in the host countries. And there's a lot of research saying that actually in the host countries, the states, the citizens, the unions, community organizations, labor organizations, they could exert different degrees of pressures on the Chinese MNCs. And those really help in shaping the labor relations in Chinese MNCs abroad. And as a result, the Chinese investors investing in host countries, instead, it's not like it's um, well-planned or well-executed planned by the central government. Instead, it is like very chaotic process, and oftentimes the implementation and the outcomes of labor relations are unpredictable in the host countries. And Li Jingquan's study in Zambia also highlight that the Chinese state capital is oftentimes more sensitive and accommodating than other type of capital, for example, from Europe, from US. They're more sensitive and accommodating to the elite's priorities and to local pressures. They felt like their Legion Grant study saying that, okay, a lot of foreign FDI from US, Europe, they are less responding to the local political pressures and the local needs. That said, Lee also thinks that all foreign capital, including Chinese capital, American capital, European capital, they all take advantage of the labor law regime in Zambia, which means like they don't have a very strict labor law regime there, and all types of capitals, they are taking advantage of their labor laws loopholes there. It's not like China is better or American capitals are better, but they just exploit the labor law system in different ways. And then, like for example, in Zambia, they just all types of capitals, no matter the countries of origins, they help like strengthening of contracting and job informalizations in Zambia, no matter what is the background of that capital. And Lee also wants to emphasize that is even though Chinese capital is so-called more responsive to political pressures, but it doesn't mean that they're particularly benign, particularly better than other foreign capitals. It's just that Chinese state capitals, they create an other capitalist subordinations and exploitation of labor and other systems. There's this different or another ways of exploiting workers that's different from the ways that it's being used by the American capital or the European capitals. It's just they're different in different ways to exploit the workers. For example, for the Chinese state employers in Zambia, Li Jingquan found that they tend to offer more secure employment. They don't have layoffs so often, but their wages are lower. But then for the American and European capitals, they offer more precarious employment, like maybe more short term, um, more layoff, but then the wages is way higher. So again, the lessons, the key takeaway from Li Chingwen's study is that the Chinese state capital is more sensitive or responsive to local political elites, but it doesn't mean that they are more labor friendly. They're still as exploiting as the American, European capital, just they exploit workers in different ways. So I have done some research about Chinese capitals, Chinese MNC in the US, and also I have like recently edited special issues on Chinese capitals in Europe. So based on my observations about Chinese MNCs in these three regions, I think there's some lessons we can learn. Like going back to the questions I began to like, oh, for a lot of labor activists, scholars outside of China, what they are concerned about CMNC mostly is will the Chinese MNC bring their exploiting labor practices to the host country? So these questions I think is context dependent. From what I observe, if Chinese MNC they goes to countries with weaker governance and weaker legal standards, social standards, the Chinese companies they tend to just bring their exploitative practices to the host countries. So there's a lot of case studies saying that all the Chinese employers, private or state, both private and state employers from China, they just like were exploiting workers a lot in the host countries. But it's interesting in Europe, we see that this doesn't happen a lot. I mean, it happens, they still exploit workers, but not like as crazy, as serious as in countries with weaker governance. So in Europe, like countries with higher social standards, legal standards, the Chinese MNC, they try to catch up. They at least at first they try to be more um, following rule and laws compliant, and also they are not as anti-unions. So Chinese employers, Chinese state, and China is very super anti-independent unions. But then in Europe, a lot of them, they actually negotiate with the unions in Europe. So in Europe, because it's like higher social standards, so I think the Chinese MNCs, they try to catch up with the norms, but oftentimes it might not be totally satisfactory. And one thing to note is like I think Chinese MNCs exploitative practices, if they're exploiting workers in host country, they are definitely responsible for that. They should be um, condemned for that. But also oftentimes they are actually exploiting the practices in host country, which means in the host countries they already have some labor unfriendly elements there, labor unfriendly practices. Like in the case of Europe, a lot of countries, European countries, they already have been implementing neoliberalisms for many years. So when Chinese companies go there, they are just following what the European countries have been doing, like subcontracting, outsourcing, and etc. So it's we could say if there's an essence or essential characters of Chinese MNC, they are exploitating, but they are also picking up the practices that is common and prevalent in host countries, and those are also shaping the labor practices in the Chinese MNC. And again, I think it is important to bear in mind that like the Chinese government or the Chinese MNCs, they are not omnipotent, they are not like mighty. Oftentimes they are very susceptible to social pressures that the union, community groups, media, or the local governments or the host governments that they generate. And changes are possible. And also like the state enterprises from China and the private capital from China, they have a difference between because like state enterprises they're owned by the Chinese government. So Chinese government have more concerned about political relations with foreign countries. So it is found out that like in some countries, state enterprises from China, they're more susceptible to pressures from the local communities. Okay, so I think that's what I wanted to share with you guys. Yeah, so I welcome any questions and comments.
A lot, Elaine, for that interesting talk on China labor relations and the sort of exportation of some of these labor relations from China to other places globally, where I think there is this increase in Chinese investments in Africa and beyond Africa. And I think you raise quite a lot of interesting issues there that probably some people would want to engage around, maybe state capitalism, authoritarian governance, and how this links with labor relations and labor regimes as well in China and also outside China. And the globalization, the incessant globalization of Chinese capital, and how this links with labor control, but also even the possibilities of labor relations and worker resistance within different contexts in China and also outside of China. So let me first, I think, allow maybe Chris to briefly respond. I don't know if Chris is online. And then I see Jimson, Pedro, and Brandon. You can come then after Crispin. Crispin, are you okay? So let me allow Jimson. You can come through, and Pedro, and then Brandon. Jimson, are you there? Brandon, go ahead. Brandon.
Afternoon. Can you hear me, Dr. Zimba?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone on the platform, and thank you, Prof, for your presentation. Very interesting from hearing from people from the other side of the world. So, Prof, my questions are maybe two, for example, where now the first one is to take you back to that institutional arrangements that you talk about, where at the top we have the state and the elites, then in the middle we have the trade unions, then the workers at the bottom. So the way you explain it is looks like the workers have little chance in terms of agitating their issues within this institutional arrangement. So I want to know some of the examples how the workers have been able to organize themselves from below to challenge this institutional arrangement that is there. And then the second question is more on the concept that you put there. I think you didn't touch a lot on it, but you were making a point of the making of the new middle class, not middle class, the making of the new working class. So I just want to touch more on that and to try to explain to us, like, what should we make of the new working class in the current neoliberal global context? Thank you, Doc.
Thanks, Brandon. Elaine, I don't know if we can take maybe 3, 4, and then you respond, and then we take the second round as well. Is that okay? Jimson, I see your hand. I'm not sure if Jimson is probably it's a legacy hand, but let me throw in my own question as well, Elaine. I didn't hear you talk much about the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which I have read some work on some time back, and I just wanted to hear from you with regards to the role that it plays, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, and if you think that its model of state-led corporatism either hinder or maybe facilitate transnational collective bargaining, given that you're looking also at transnational corporations that are operating abroad, in what way do they facilitate or even hinder transnational collective bargaining and also the workers' voice in different contexts? So maybe I can I'll allow you to respond, and then we'll take the second round of questions after that.
So thank you for the questions. For Brandon, the first questions like how like without a unions that genuinely organizing the workers or representing the workers' interests, how do workers stay respond or fight for their own rights? So in China, they have a lot of wildcat strikes, which means the workers just organize themselves. They don't actually, sometimes they don't even organize themselves. They, like for example, in a workplace, for example, at a factory. So maybe the workers, they have been talking about some grievances for a long time, like low wages, no overtime compensation. They've been talking it for months. And then maybe just one day, one worker was super angry. Then he turned off the switches of the assembly line. And then they started to ask, oh, all the workers to go out, stop working. And then other workers who felt the same, they just follow suit. So this is type of like wildcat strike that's happening in China. And also previously, but now there's labor NGO, labor non-governmental organizations, labor NGOs. They used to help workers a lot in organizing, facilitating strike, and facilitating collective bargaining on the side of the workers. But now they're all crushed by the government. Basically, they cannot do anything right now, or a lot of them, they were being disbanded. And also in the past, the workers, they try to call for democratic reform of ACFTU, of the workplace unions, because they know they're not democratic. No workers will ever get a vote to vote in the unions. In some part of China, when the political environment were a little bit more open before Xi Jinping came into power, some part of China.
Sorry, let me.
I just worry that you guys.
Yeah, sorry about that,
okay,
Chile.
no problem, no problem. So, so then some workers were trying to call for democratic reform of the trade unions, but at the end, after like many years of trial and error, but it didn't really yield anything. And also, at one point, some workers they tried to set up the unions according to the labor laws, which means they try to set up some union that is going to be affiliated to the ACFTU. But even then, they get crushed by the government. A lot of the workers get jailed, and the student activists supporting the workers they were jailed. And then the new working class persons. So the new working class persons is a little bit complicated because before the economic reform, the workers, they are all urban workers that they work for the state-owned enterprises. But then with the economic reform, a lot of foreign investment coming and a lot of migrant workers from rural areas that they used to be peasant farmers. And then the next generations, they are the migrant workers, internal migrant workers in China. And they increasingly become the major working forces in China. But at first, they were not being seen as workers. ACFTU, the unions, for a long time, they didn't let the migrant workers to be admitted to be union members. So here what I meant, new working class, or what the scholars were saying, the new working class, they mean actually the new working class that no longer comprise predominantly by the urban workers, but predominantly consisting of the migrant workers. And about Simber's questions about ACFTU, it's largely still controlled by the government, by the state. And when political atmosphere become more relaxed, which means not right now, which means the previous government, before Xi Jinping came into power, political environment is more relaxed. So some of the ACFTU affiliates, they were open to some type of soft reform, or they were open to having collaborations with labor NGOs. But now the political environment in China after Xi Jinping came into power is more controlled, and the Xi Jinping government has been emphasizing on ACFT as an ideological apparatus. They emphasizing on how ACFTU should be following their party's agenda. There's no more institutional reform of ACFTU, and their role in strikes and collective bargaining in China basically is nothing. They don't organize workers to strike, and when there's worker strike, ACFTU and their subordinates or the affiliates, they just went to the scenes and tried to talk workers out of the strike. And collective bargaining, they never really, collective bargaining, they don't call it collective bargaining in China to begin with. They call it collective consultations, which is sounds more harmonious because they don't think workplace relations is conflictual, so therefore they don't need bargaining, they just need to have consultations. So oftentimes, like ACFTU, they don't really initiate meaningful collective bargaining that is happening in South Africa, or Europe, or US. And I just want to also note one thing is about the increasing influence of ACFTU in their international labor terrain. I think in the past decades, ACFTU has been trying to be more active in like ILO or in some of their global unions. And I think their strategy at first is to be active, but also be quiet. They try to have more one-on-one interactions with unions on their own. And so they I think gradually they have actually established quite a lot of connections with unions also from other authoritarian countries. And overall, I think ACFTU's influence at the international level has increased a lot. And I don't know of any cases responding to Simba that ACFTU is proactively or passively trying to support workers in the host countries or facilitate collective bargaining in the host countries. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Elaine, for that. Yeah, I see Crispin has thrown in a few questions on the chat. I don't know, are you able to speak, Crispin, before we take the second round of questions? Okay, maybe let me just read out Crispin's questions. I think Crispin is saying, thanks, Elaine.
Yes, Bamni?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Crispin.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Elaine. Very interesting sort of subject that we are trying to understand here from the African sort of like context, trying to grappling with how to understand Chinese labor relations. So my question is around how is it likely that this Chinese model, China is going to be able to maintain, I don't know whether to call this hegemony for the future. Is it likely, or are we likely not to get to a breaking point in as far as the hegemony is concerned? And then what about, I don't know if I can flip the question around, what about in sort of Western corporations that are also moving to China? How are they sort of, I don't know, maybe this may be an unfair question, but how are they, I know there are quite some big corporations that are also moving to China. How are they adapting to this Chinese sort of like labor regime, the so-called sort of Western sort of like corporates? Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So those are very good questions. I'm not sure I can answer them very well. So maintaining, how is China likely able to maintain this hegemony in future? It's just increasingly difficult. I think I myself categorize Xi Jinping's, like my work was saying, oh, China has for a while this incipient hegemony. So it's not totally ruling depending on coercive measures, but also there's some hegemonic foundations that the Chinese state is building to get the consent of the workers. But that's mostly with the previous administrations. So with Xi Jinping, I was arguing that is having an eroding hegemony, which means the hegemonic foundation that was laid before, for example, giving workers concessions, and trying to making the workers' interests being seen as related to the overall interests of the capitalists and etc. But those are become weaker and weaker. a lot of actually after Xi Jinping came into power, there's no major labor law reform in China or no major labor law introductions to China. But in the previous administrations, there are like various labor law reform that makes labor law more protective of workers. But after Xi Jinping came into power for more than 10 years, there's no such a labor law reform in China. And also, there's one, because of the pandemic of the COVID, a lot of workers, they are increasingly discontented with the situations in China. Because of the pandemic and also because of China's economic structural issues, Chinese economic growth is actually downturning and has been talking in the media for a long time that Chinese is not doing as well, which is true. During the pandemic and the subsequent years after the pandemic, Chinese GDP is lower than in 1989, which is like a major democratic event in China. So economically, China is doing very bad. And also politically, a lot of Chinese workers, Chinese citizens, general public, they're very discontented with the zero COVID policies in China. So as a result, back then in 2022, around 2022, there's the white paper movement in China, which means a lot more, there's waves of protest in China that is calling for Xi Jinping to resign and to calling to the end of their zero COVID policies. And one very senior Chinese scholars were saying that this is the major challenges or the biggest challenges the Chinese Communist Party has ever faced since 1989, which is a democratic movement, political movement in China in 1989. But since 1989, this white paper movement in 2020 is like the biggest challenge to the Communist Party. So I would say like, and also after that, around that period of time of COVID, a lot of people, they just left the country through irregular migrations. And I talked to those people, and then a lot of them were really very critical of the Chinese political system, political control, and the economic situations in China. So I would say like it's hard for the Chinese government or the Xi government to maintain the hegemony unless they are more willing to share their profit with the people, like with the workers, like work better in increasing workers' wages and provide better benefits, social welfare, and etc. But all those we haven't seen signs of that it might be possible in the future. The second question is how to cope with labor regime in Chinese context. Maybe the second question is about the labor regime in China and the Western corporations I can answer together. So for a long time, actually, since Chinese opening up in 1978, there's a lot of Chinese corporations. I mean, the Western corporations coming to China, like Walmart, a lot, anyway, a lot of car companies and etc. They are not better. I mean, like a lot of time they're exploiting. They are the one that exploit workers too. They have low wages. Like when they were at home, like European countries, European companies, American companies, when they're at home, they were doing well. I mean, in terms of following labor laws. But once they're in China, because China is a very loose legal environment, once they're in China, they just don't follow the law. They just like don't give the compensation that workers they need. Or they promise to workers that they will pay the wage arrears. They don't respect unions. Don't respect the workers' right to talk to the managers and etc. So I would say the foreign investors from the Western company, they came to China and they also contribute to the exploiting practices, exploiting coercive labor regime in China. It's not just contributed by the government. About how to deal with the labor regime in China, I think the Chinese government, at least at this point, it seems like they won't be proactively try to reform the system to make it more labor friendly or to protect workers' right better. I think it all depends on the workers' initiatives. They take actions, like whether they are willing to take actions to protest employers, to ask for better legal protections. I think it's the momentum or the pressures really should come from the workers, and only from the workers that the government may feel the pressures and they might need to lead to some reform.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elaine, for that. I think maybe we can take the last round of questions. Pedro, go ahead. Pedro, and then Jimson.
Thank you very much, Simba, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick one, Elaine. How would an Africa-China working class solidarity moment or option look like in your book?
Thanks, Pedro. Jimson, are you there? Oh, I think we've lost Jimson. Maybe let me throw in another one, Elaine, that's also sort of related to Pedro's question. I'm interested in how transnational value chains and the geopolitical power sort of shape and reshape labor agency, but also resistance within China, but also even in overseas workspaces where multinational and transnational companies go to operate. So I'm interested in trying to understand if there are, I mean, from your research, if there are any new forms of transnational labor solidarity, or maybe we are seeing some kind of continued fragmentation under the global production of this Chinese capital that is expanding in Africa and other parts of the world. Are we seeing any new forms of transnational labor solidarity, or we are seeing continued fragmentation under global production regimes that's dominated by the Chinese capital?
Yeah, those are very big questions. That reminds me of yeah, that's very good, important questions. So maybe I can answer them both at the same time. So my book didn't actually, my book was about China and it's not about Chinese investment. So I'm going to write a book on Chinese investment. So maybe in the coming book, I will talk about working class solidarity. But I think I was researching on one company in China, in the US, Chinese company in the US, and they actually have some Chinese workers that they deploy from China to the US. And I think also that Chinese MNC in the US also hire some Chinese that is originally like residing in the US. I was sad to say that I think for the union's effort to organize this company, they also hire a lot of Americans. So the American unions, they try to organize the Americans. I think the one trap that they fell into is falling into this nationalism. So there was one union trying to organize these factories, and largely they resort to nationalist rhetoric, saying that, oh, the Chinese is bad. Of course, the Chinese owners is very exploitating, it's true, but they try by saying that, oh, all Chinese is bad, and also by saying like, have a very general or very commonsensical diagnosis like Chinese is bad, wherever they're excluding the Chinese workers that's working in the plant. And the Chinese workers, they don't feel they don't feel comfortable to join. And in fact, a lot of Chinese workers were voting against the union. I think like it's like for situation like this, like when Chinese MNC goes to host countries to invest, I think we should think about like, oh, should we use the nationalist strategies or should we use class solidarity perspectives? Like I think Petrol and Zimber, you guys are totally right that actually we should think about class solidarity. And the working class, they should be aligned together, fight against the capitalists, not like, oh, Americans, they fight against Chinese. If with that nationalist mentality, we can never achieve anything. I think one difficulty, one challenge is related to working class solidarities between Chinese workers and the workers in the host country is the Chinese workers, they are not in a very good conditions to really build up transnational relations with other workers. First of all, they're not really organized in China. There's no like union to, I mean, like the independent, genuine unions that can represent them to reach out to other unions in South Africa, let's say. So then the workers, they themselves should not have the institutional resources, even like languages, skills, wherever to help build that solidarity. And so I think this is the major challenge. But previously there might be some, like I said, that there's some labor organizations, labor NGOs in China, they were playing this type of roles, trying to connect the Chinese workers campaign with other workers in other part of the world. But then now the Xi government crushed all the Chinese labor NGO. So I think it's to be honest, I'm a little pessimistic about like build real class solidarities, like with real workers in China. But I think this is the right directions. We just need to see what would happen and then do what we can do at the moment.
Thanks, Elaine. I think there's a quick one from one of our master students who is saying, how do you see Gramsci's idea of hegemony fitting within China's unique capitalist system or labor relations? And I think you highlighted, this kind of variant of Chinese capitalism, that, China is not really socialist, but it's also practicing a very kind of unique capitalist ideas and practices. So she's asking how do you see Gramsci's idea of hegemony fitting within China's unique capitalist system or labor relations? I don't know, you might want to reflect on that.
Yeah. So my first book is actually about this topic. Like I was saying, the Chinese state, at first, their role is to push forward this passive revolutions, introduce capitalism with top-down measures. But over time, after 20 decades of their capitalist reform was being introduced, I also noticed that the Chinese government, Chinese state has become more hegemonic in the sense that it's trying to use various soft tactics to get the consent of the workers. And my book was focusing on the role of the laws in building up hegemony for the Chinese state. And I see that like the labor laws reform that I mentioned before Xi Jinping era was actually exercising a very important influence on workers to give the consent to the state and the capitalist system. The workers see that I have like four mechanisms that I described in how the laws help securing consent. I forgot exactly the name, but the basic idea is like, oh, the labor law, the existence of the labor law makes the workers feel like the state is protecting them. Okay, they don't feel like the state is on the side of the capitalists. And secondly is there's the central government, there's local government, as I mentioned. The workers see that the central government actually have very good intention to protect us. They are the one who implemented all those good laws. It's just the local government that they are not implementing the laws, they're violating the laws. So that actually, this labor law system help protect the central government or the political system as a whole from workers, from the meta criticisms. They actually makes their protect the central government, and then for the workers, they wouldn't think of like, oh, we should be opposing the whole government, or we should not be opposing the central government. And they keep their criticisms just pointed towards the local government. And then also the law makes the capitalists and the collision between the capitalists and the states feels very distinct instead of, oh, they are forming a coalition. Because the law makes the workers feel like, okay, the government wants to discipline the capitalists. They're not. The government is not on the side of the capitalists. And therefore, the law helps the state to conceal the collusion between the state and capitalists from the workers. So I think this is how law works as a hegemonic mechanisms for the states to get the consent of the workers.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elaine, for that. And I think unless maybe if there are any pressing questions, we are a few minutes over time, and I know Elaine is a very tight schedule. So thank you very much, Elaine, for agreeing to share your work with us and engage with us as well. And thank you everyone who has attended. We really appreciate your attendance and your contributions. And for those that might want to be on our mailing list, you can share your email. This semester, of course, we are left with only one seminar, so we definitely invite you. And Elaine, we really appreciate your insightful work, and we'll definitely call you again in the future to share your work with us. So we really appreciate that.
Great. Thank you, Simba, for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate, and do enjoy the rest of your day and weekend.
Thank you. Bye. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Elaine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.